Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Creating Belonging podcast. Today, I have with me Tony Chatman. Tony, thank you for joining me. And if you would, just take a moment to introduce yourself.
Hey, Justin. So thanks for having me. I'm a corporate relationship expert. And really, what that means is when we look at the workplace, a lot of people focus on products and process, but I feel like most people don't come into the workplace prepared for the people dimension, right? And so if we learn how to leverage the relationships, literally the people side of the workplace, that can either be our competitive advantage, or if we don't, it could be our Achilles tendon. And, a little backstory for me, I got into that because I came into the workplace as a chemical engineer. And so I was very well prepared for that product and process side, but I quickly learned that I got a lot more done because of how I treated people than because of what I knew.
That's an amazing realization, and glad that you're in and doing that work. Um, as so with typically with my guests, I like to ask them to disclose any identities that they'd like to share, just to kind of ground us in the conversation and understand perspectives we might be bringing to the table. What identities would you mind sharing with our audience?
Um, Black, cis heterosexual, US, Gen X. Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
So kind of before we hit record, we started talking about kind of belonging and perspectives on belonging. And so before we go there, I want to talk a little bit about the work that you do and kind of how belonging plays into that. And so in particular, in your work, you talk about relationship-based leadership. And so I'd love to hear how belonging plays into relation-based leadership.
Sure. So, and it, I think we all have to look at how we're going to define belonging, right? I think that that's part of the challenge. And there are so many ways. I know you have an incredible framework for it, which we may or may not talk a little bit about. One of the things that I have noticed after surveying thousands of people, when asking them, what do you want in the workplace? And especially in the phrase, what makes you feel included, right?
Mhm.
Although belonging, that word came up, the trend that we saw was that there were two words that seemed to compose everything. And that was value and respect. And so, really, from my vantage point, what I look at a lot is how do we ensure that when people are in the workplace, that they are valued as human beings, valued for what they bring to the table, and respected. And in many ways, although it's hard to get to a lot of the nuances of what different people will determine as actual belonging, that seems to cover a lot of it in a lot of the situations. And so that's kind of the starting point. And the reason that I do it is, you know, realistically, when I got into becoming a professional speaker, I had a lot of things I could talk about, right? I had a strong background in leadership. I had a strong background in change management, strong background in communication. But I kept thinking to myself, number one, most people spend the majority of their waking hours at work. So in many ways, it begins to define their experience.
Mhm.
Number two, most people have never had multiple great bosses.
Mhm.
If we're going to just, be real, when you
Mhm.
talk about not decent, not good, but great, however you define a great boss, asking people, hey, have you ever had two great bosses in a row? They look at you like, you're asking them to define Bigfoot. I mean, it's one of those funny things. And I thought this shouldn't be. And a lot of the issues that people have revolve around their relationship with their boss, supervisor, manager, whatever phrase you want to say. And so those two things really kind of cemented the direction I wanted to go. And I realized that looking at it through that lens framed how I could look at a lot of different things and helped me to more easily define a lot of the phrases that we use as buzzwords in ways that are a lot more simple.
I want to riff a little bit on so you mentioned value and respect as what people want at work and kind of playing into that belonging. And And I see those related to, so in the creating belonging work, I talk about belonging being created at the intersection of authenticity and acceptance. And I think value and respect sit really nicely in that acceptance piece. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, you talk a bit about kind of getting people pushed out of their comfort zone. And I think that oftentimes accepting others can push us out of our comfort zone, right? It may require us to challenge or suspend our own values. Not valuing others, but I mean like our own personal values. It may, you know, present some challenges there. So I'm curious, how do you work with folks to push them out of their comfort zone to create that acceptance or value or respect of their people to build those relationships?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it really comes down to empathy, right? We're all trying to have a human experience, whether in society or in the workplace. And so, really, that empathy, helping to see another person's vantage point, looking at the world through their eyes, walking in their shoes, is really a great starting point. Now, what I happen to do in a lot of my work is I combine that with really giving people an understanding of unconscious bias. And in a way that I think is different than many people have experienced that phrase, but understanding biases, although we often think of it in terms of, prejudice and discrimination, it's a much larger umbrella. And it really is a focus on how we make decisions, how we interpret our realities. And that a lot of it, number one, is we're using our most ineffective part of our brain to do it. But the other part of it is most of the narratives, because I like to use the word narrative. One of my close friends, she's got me thinking this way, and she would say, well, you did this. And so the story I told myself was this, right? Because we're filling in blanks.
Mhm.
And to help people understand, a lot of the ways that we fill in those blanks or tell our story is a function of our previous experiences. It's how we were raised, who raised us, where we were raised, our education system, our religious experiences, our personal experiences. When you start looking at all of these different things, you realize we have a very subjective point of view. And we begin to expand that and take other people's points of view into consideration, it allows us to rehumanize them.
Mhm.
And so I really feel like it's a lot of it's remembering that everyone's a human being. And I think we forget that. We look at them as, well, they think differently, they have very different values. And so then what we do is we demonize them. But the way you demonize someone is you first have to dehumanize them so that you can demonize them without having a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? And not a lot of, I'm a bad person because I'm demonizing. Well, no, they deserve it. Look at who they really are. And so you
Yeah.
start taking that away and you rehumanize people, then it's harder to demonize and discriminate against them. And so I think that is kind of the foundation that I lay so that we can start having these conversations so that we get to value. And I really, I intentionally use the word value even more than acceptance. And I do it because of conversations I've had over the last few years as the world's been going through this social conversation. And I constantly hear people saying, we need to be more tolerant. And I would just ask them, so are you tolerating me right now? Is that kind of what we're doing? Because I need to know. You know what I mean? If the best we're going to do is that you tolerate me, that's not an acceptable level. And I want to make sure that we can get beyond that. I think acceptance is a good level, but I like the idea of valuing people for all the various reasons we can talk about.
I really like that. And yeah, I think tolerance, it's an interesting word because then if you ask someone if you've ever felt tolerated and then ask them, did that feel good? They're probably going to say no, right? So we definitely need more than tolerance. And I like this idea of value and rehumanizing people because I talk about bias too, and from that perspective that you have bias because you're human.
Right.
End story. And I think for too long we've built up bias to be a bad thing, but it's not a bad thing. It actually keeps us alive. Like the structure of our brain that's doing that thing, it keeps us alive on a daily basis, but it also gets in the way of modern decisions. And exactly that of like it helps us dehumanize people. And so we have to then work kind of more consciously to rehumanize people. So I really like the way that you've described that and your perspective on how we rehumanize people.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things I'd like to say about that is you're absolutely right. Bias is a human condition, right? Although we can reprogram some of our biases, I agree with you. Bias in and of itself is not bad. It's the fact that we're not conscious that is making the decisions, right? Like,
Mhm.
quick example. I was in Juneau, Alaska, doing some work in February of 2017, I think it was. And so I wanted to go see Mendenhall Glacier, right? And so I'm at the glacier, but it's kind of this weird time. It's like 40 degrees, so it's not things aren't as frozen as they should be, but there's ice. It was an ice storm. And I don't know if you've ever been to Mendenhall Glacier or Juneau, Alaska.
Yeah.
But there's like a frozen lake that you walk across to get to the actual glacier. So you can see it from the state park, but you can walk across this frozen lake during the winter and like get to the glacier and like walk inside of it. And so, but I'm like, it's 40 degrees. So I'm kind of walking and I'm like, am I gonna, I go like 40 yards. I'm like, I don't know if this thing's gonna like crack or whatever. And then in that moment, I turn to my left, and here come three guys geared up, right? They got the spike boots and the ski poles, and they do this every day. And they just walk right past me like it's nothing. And they've said nothing to me. But in that moment, my conscious bias was, oh, they know what they're doing. I can follow them, right? That's still a bias because I'm telling myself a story based on incomplete information. But because I was conscious of it, it's a very different thing than if I'm unconsciously treating someone based on an urge or a feeling that I'm not even recognizing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the trouble, to your point, the trouble is when we feel like our decisions are 100% made in our conscious brain, that we have control over that, I think that's where we get in trouble. We have to understand that our brain is wired to be efficient. It makes decisions for us on a regular basis. And once we understand that, we can then start to think about, okay, how do I override it when it needs to be overridden?
Yeah, exactly. And to your point, functional MRIs show us that about 90% of the decisions we make on a daily basis originate out of our subconscious, right?
Mhm.
95% of our buying decisions. So when you start to understand that, it makes you really rethink everything.
Yes. Yes. So when we were talking earlier, we were talking a bit about kind of belonging and the positionality of belonging with the greater DEIB and or any other letters we want to throw into this body of work that we do. And the role of I want to tee up the topic of the role of belonging in diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. I think I've captured the most of the things we're throwing in.
Justice sometimes.
Well, sorry, what was that?
Sometimes people put in justice.
Oh, yes, justice. So yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on the positionality of belonging in that greater kind of sphere of work.
All righty, here we go. Here's our fun conversation, right? Because we did start. I just kind of shared my bottom line thought with you, but I think it's a much more complicated thought, right?
Hmm.
So I think that belonging is a critical component of culture,
Hmm.
an organization's culture. And if you want to have a healthy workplace culture, belonging, I mean, the studies show that when people feel like they belong, when they think they're cared about, when they're valued, right? You start talking about production increases, innovation increases, resilience increases, retention increases, right? The business case is nearly overwhelming. I mean, it's just mind blowing when you really think of all the things that are there. That being said, I struggle to have it in the conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I do that for a few reasons. Now, on the positive side, or if I were going to argue for it, there are organizations that come to the realization that they need to focus on, DEI or whatever, because some type of climate or culture survey has told them that certain demographics view the organization differently, and they view that they fit in differently. They view that that they are valued, that they belong very differently. That being said, here's why I struggle. If you looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, and you can argue whether Maslow's hierarchy of needs is, the perfect model or not, whatever. But there's this idea that kind of at the bottom level, there's these psychological needs or physiological needs, I should say, that are things like, food, water, sex, excretion, breathing, right? Above that, there's safety. And a lot of this is, although we often talk a lot about psychological safety, this is physical safety in many ways, right? But there's also economic safety, the safety of employment, the safety of having resources, the safety of your family. There's all these things. Above that, normally on the pyramid, is where you get things like love and belonging. And the idea that the pyramid is stacked this way, and it's arguable, obviously, is that before you can focus on this third tier, if you don't have 2 and 1 done, if you don't feel safe, if you can't eat, you're not thinking about belonging.
Mm-hmm.
So my challenge with putting belonging in the DEI space is when you look at equity and inclusion, those are hitting the physiological and the safety needs. You're talking about, can I get a job? Can I afford to feed my family? I'm coming to work, but I was the second African American to ever graduate from my university with the degree I had. I know lots of people who were the first Black person, the first Chinese person, the first Mexican person. I'm being very specific with these identities, to ever work in their job. And their lives were threatened. Their tires were slashed. Some of them, their houses were vandalized, right? I mean, you're talking about real safety issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people who have yet to get equity and inclusion don't have the luxury to think about belonging.
Yeah.
So that's my challenge with this conversation about belonging. I think it applies to everyone. And I think that in many ways, it can be an indicator of, strong needs in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. But what I see is a focus on belonging at the expense of equity and inclusion. And I think that is going down a very dangerous road.
Yeah. Okay, let's have some fun with this. One thing I want to share something that I don't think I've shared it like on the podcast or publicly, and I think it's interesting to this conversation. So I wrote my book Creating Belonging over 2 years ago, and a year ago was really getting settled into my business and kind of working through how I'm going to market, all of that, and was working with my coach and working through like, Justin, you need the one thing, like what's your one thing that you're really going to focus in on, and or kind of the marketplace focus. And I had 3 things and I was like, well, here and here. And she's like, no, Justin, we need one. And she kept pushing me into DEIB. She's like, you do DEIB work. And I said, no, absolutely not. That is not where my business sits. That's not what I do. And I don't want to muddy the waters, because I think there are people that do pure DEI work differently and better than I do. Yes, I wrote a book titled Creating Belonging, but I think it sits a little bit different, and it can sit in that greater DEIB space, But I'm like, there's other pieces to this puzzle that aren't, I'm interested in them, I'm passionate about them, but I don't think that I'm the one to go fix them necessarily, right? As far as where my interest, where my talent lies. And so I wanted to throw that out there as an interesting positionality of, I've tussled with this a bit in my own work of where does Justin and his business sit in the world? And so kind of to that point of, where does it sit? Here's the way I think about it. I want to tee this up and I'm curious your reaction. I think that inclusion, specifically inclusion, are acts like we do things that are inclusive of people, right? We do things to include people. When we do inclusion through a diversity lens, we're ensuring that we're creating getting a diverse population of people that are included in that. And if we're doing it equitably, we're doing it in a way that gives people what they need, not just equal treatment. When we get all of that stuff right, belonging is the outcome.
Yes, I could not agree. Listen, number one, you and I probably share more similarities as we're having this conversation than we realize. I fought against being in the DEI space for the first 9 years of my business, even though I was constantly being asked to and pushed into. And what we haven't, so now it's my turn to ask you a question. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, and I think people who listen to your podcast already know this, but we haven't had this conversation.
Yeah.
Would you mind sharing some of your identities?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, white, cisgender, gay, man. Something that I talk about a lot. I grew up in rural Iowa, so most everyone around me looked like me, but I live in Chicago. And so very different space. And I share that because it very much influences the lens that I have and the blinders that I'm constantly beating back and the programmed bias that's inside me that I'm constantly trying to fight and overcome. So yeah, that's a bit of mine, and yeah, I share that a lot, but we haven't had that conversation. So yeah.
Well, number one, thank you for sharing, because I mean, these vulnerabilities are not things that are always easy, and in some cases aren't always welcome. So I really appreciate it. Going to this conversation we're having, there are probably at different stages of your life, various times that you did not feel like you belong, sometimes based on some of your various identities, right? I mean, you can go through it. And sometimes it's based on an identity that people don't think about, right? You grew up in Iowa and moved to Chicago. I grew up in Kalamazoo and moved to Chicago. That was a culture shock for me and for everyone else around me, right? So, but the thing that you said is that if we do all of these things right, belonging becomes the outcome. I think you can say that about almost every component of DEI, B, A, J, whatever letter, right? That the goal is not to manufacture diversity. The goal is to do the two things in such a way that diversity is the outcome. The goal is not to manufacture equity or manufacture inclusion, but if we do things correctly, then equity, inclusion, diversity, acceptance, belong. I mean, I just think about this. We had to say, hey, we need to add inclusion to diversity because somebody was doing diversity without inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We had to add equity. I've said for years, really is D&I, diversity and inclusion, because equity is an aspect of inclusion. How can you have equity if you don't have inclusion? How can you have accessibility if you don't have inclusion? How can you have belonging, right? But I understand the need to keep parsing this out, but it seems like we go after the labels instead of understanding. And this is where I think, because I say we're similar, for me, I fought this, and I always tell people I am not a DEI expert. I tell my clients I'm not a DEI practitioner. I'm not. I do understand workplace culture. And if we do culture right, then we will get this as an outcome. And yes, at times we need to focus on this, just as, if you were in ICU because you just had a stroke, there's parts of your body you must focus on in that moment, but that does not mean that you don't care about the whole body. And so I think that's kind of how we should be thinking about this.
Yeah. Well, and I like that you focus on it from the culture perspective, because I think any organization that doesn't look at the big picture is going to fail at it, whatever it is that we're defining it as. So, organizations that don't have their culture right, the inclusion pieces, but that you can go and hire diverse talent, talent that doesn't look like the talent that we have today, but you now have people that, if we don't have our unconscious bias under control, we don't let right, those people are not going to last very long. And I've been in those organizations where the focus is just on the diversity numbers, but the diversity numbers never stay where they want them to be, because the higher turnover is in the marginalized populations, because those people still don't feel like they, for me, it's that they feel like they don't belong. We don't have the right inclusion. And so they're like, peace out. I don't belong here. I got to go somewhere else. And so that's where I don't mind, I don't know, I don't mind lumping it in there, because I do think it's an important component, but I also really respect the identification that, like, there's a lot of moving pieces here and they all have to be working right.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying it that way. I look at the whole thing as, too often we're trying to build a pipeline, but if you don't fix the leak, the product's never going to get to the right place. And so it is, you can't just build the pipeline. You have to fix the leaks of not belonging, fix the leaks of not being inclusive, fix the leaks of not being equitable, and that will solve a lot of the problems.
I love that we chatted through this, because
Me
I think
too.
it's good to I think it's good to really dig through some of the definitions and how we're viewing things to be able to move forward productively. I would it at kind of last transition of conversation, one thing I would love to hear is, I always love to hear people's personal stories of belonging or not belonging. And I'd love to hear from you, kind of in your journey. You've already mentioned one thing, coming from Kalamazoo to Chicago. There's that. I'm curious if there's a story that you wouldn't mind sharing of either finding belonging or not having it.
Sure, and I think it's fascinating. I think they both can happen at the same time, which
Mm,
sounds like a strange, almost an oxymoron.
hmm.
But I mentioned earlier, so I said I was a chemical engineer, but technically my degree was in paper science, which is a specialized form of chemical engineering. When I graduated from Western Michigan, I was the second African American to ever graduate from that university with my degree. It's highly specialized, highly valued, highly competitive, and we walked out with the highest salaries as undergrads, right? But that also meant I walked into an industry that's not used to having me.
Hmm.
And often I was going to paper mills in very small areas where I may be there. You don't think Black people when you think Morrilton, Arkansas, when you think Madawaska, Maine, when you think International Falls, Minnesota, right? I mean, there are places that when I went, you had the combination of just the unfamiliarity of dealing with someone like this, but also the very conscious biases. Me sitting in my boss's office as he's talking to a client, the client not knowing that he's on speakerphone and I'm in the room, and he's saying, "So yeah, that monkey that you sent up to the mill last week got lost, right?" Speaking of me, so that was a very real, very constant experience for me. At the same time, while working for that very same organization, I can think of one particular regional man. I can actually think of a regional sales manager, but a district manager, um, who I won't even mention his name. I don't even know if he's still alive, but he saw me, and I think that's the word I want to use. he saw me. He saw me. He saw my intelligence. He saw my social skills. He saw that even though all those things I just mentioned are very real, by the time I was in a client space for a half hour, they loved me. And he knew it. And he always said, listen, if you ever want to come into the field in my district, I will always have a spot for you. And I tell people to this day, I'm a business owner. I've been a business owner for over 20 years. I can't imagine being an employee. I just, it's, dude, no way. But if I had to, I would consider it for him. He was that guy because he valued me and had a vision in me. And so within his sphere, I felt like I belonged, even though in the greater ecosystem, I didn't.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think there's, I talk a bit about the fluidity of belonging, right? Like it can go up and down, and it depends on who we're with at the time. And, belonging, our state of belonging doesn't stay static with a greater organization. It can vary from team to team, or in your case, kind of being client facing, you could go into one organization in an area of the country that is, not as enlightened. I don't know, trying to think of a better word.
Good enough. That works.
And then, or go to another client that is, very, open, accepting, so yeah, I think that it can be very fluid. And it's interesting in the podcast, the conversations that I'm having, we talk a lot about that fluidity, and even being able to parts of ourselves, parts of our identities being able to be open and feeling belonging with them, and some that maybe we can still kind of hide away but still feel belonging. And so it's an interesting dichotomy with that.
Yeah, if I could add something to this idea of fluidity, I think part of the reason that our belonging, part of the reason that our belonging is a fluid thing is because going back to the word we used earlier, bias is also a fluid thing. It is very situational, right? When I lived in New York, I played basketball with this group of guys 4 times a week. Half of them were NYPD, right? And we're to this day, we have a group chat, and it's a wild ride on that group chat. But we are buddies, and I know if I ever needed anything, every one of them will have my back. Mm-hmm. But I also know from their very own mouths, when they enter into their beat mode, their cop mode, and they're in certain areas, they are very different people. Because there's very different dangers, very different experiences, very different realities, all of these things. And I'm not saying it's justifiable or good or bad or whatever, but I'm saying that is the reality, that this person can be this way in this environment and step into a completely different environment or have a completely different emotion and have a very different response.
Yes. Yes. Context can absolutely shift, heighten our biases, shift our biases. But yeah, the context can really shift that. And thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Tony, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I have a feeling we could keep talking forever, and maybe we will. But for this conversation, I want to put a bow on it. But I do want to make sure that people can find you. So if people want to reach out to you, Tony, what's the best ways to find you?
The easiest thing, if you can spell my name, which the last name is CHAT as in Tom, MAN, I'm TonyChatman.com. So my website's there, links to all of my socials there, emails there. Social media, I'm either Tony Chatman, or on Instagram and TikTok, I'm Tony Chatman Speaks, just because Tony Chatman was taken. And so, whichever, your flavor is that you like the best, find me in that space and I'm there.
Perfect. And I will make sure to add some links in the show notes so people can link to that more easily if they have access to that. But again, Tony, thank you so much for joining me today. And
I was just going to say, great conversation. Yeah. And I appreciate you providing a space to have the back and forth that we had, because I'm actually sharing thoughts that I've been thinking for a while, but have never shared publicly. So I appreciate that.
I love that. Thank you. I love hearing different perspectives, and I'm not afraid of seeing where the conversation will go. So uh,
Absolutely.
I appreciate you sharing. Thank you, Tony, and join us again for another episode of the Creating Belonging podcast. Thanks.